Bishop Stephen, thank you very much indeed for that warm welcome. It is indeed good to be back in Sheffield. I come to Sheffield quite often in my role, another of the jobs I have as chair of the College of Evangelists, and we work very closely in partnership with Church Army. And is my good friend Mark Russell here? There he is. He did promise he wouldn't heckle. Just keep him under control, those of you at the back, would you? And I always appreciate coming to Sheffield. As Bishop Stephen said, my most esoteric role is as Lord High Almoner. And the last time I gave a lecture in the cathedral was to Maundy recipients at about this time this year. So the audience is looking wonderfully youthful today. I do think sometimes it's one of the good things about ministering in the Church of England that you can have the illusion of perpetual youth, because most of the people to whom you're ministering will probably be older than you are. And it comes as a bit of a shock when you go out in the outside world and realise maybe you're getting old after all. Leadership, as Bishop Stephen has said, I serve on FEOC, which produced a report on senior church leadership, which, if you haven't read, I hope you will. Loveday will clarify later this afternoon that it's available on the internet. It's going to be published later this year, and I think it's well worth reading. Loveday deserves much of the credit for the production of that report and the thinking that went into it. And I do think it's a really good resource. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on leadership. It's a bit of a worrying thing to do, isn't it? It's like claiming to be an expert on humility. Have you read my good book on humility? It's a dangerous thing to do, and it's certainly not my special subject. Place seems to become my special subject. I thought I was choosing something less controversial, but even that is a bit of a hot topic nowadays. I'm slightly wary of having special subjects anyway. I was quoting last night my favourite Mastermind episode, where this poor victim sat down in that big black chair, and Magnus Magnusson, as it was then, began to quiz him and said, your name? And he said his name, and he said, your special subject? And this poor man went, what was it now? And I really felt for him. He did go on to recover quite well. Leadership, though, I do have a passing interest in the subject. And the title that I've chosen, under the banner of Take Me to Your Leader, is Leadership Angst, where we are now. We are angst-ridden as a church about the whole question of leadership. And if you're not, then you'll be unusual. And I want to ask why that is, and then I want to suggest a way through, which I hope will be encouraging to you. And I'd be very surprised if I'm going to be saying anything to you today that you don't already know. But I hope that when it's articulated, you might say, yes, of course, and be encouraged. There are thousands of examples on the internet of people saying things like, the church needs leaders who? We tend to think in terms of ministry in terms of leadership rather than ministry nowadays, and I think that is symptomatic of an angst, and Loveday, I think, will make reference to that later. So the first question is, why have we got ourselves into such a pickle over the question of leadership? Why is it such an angst-ridden subject? And it seems to me that the answer is very straightforward, the answer to that question. The reason we've got ourselves into such difficulty is that the world has got itself into such difficulty, and we are reflecting angst out there in society. If you were to Google leadership, as I did in an idle moment, you'd be presented with 465 million references on Google. That's quite a lot. And whatever else it means, it's surely indicative of a great thirst for good leaders and instruction on how to become one. Richard Dawkins wrote in the Financial Times a bit back, there is a fixation bordering on obsession on the qualities needed for leadership. Now, I've read quite a lot on leadership in the past. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. Sorting it out, discerning what's the good and what's the bad is quite tricky. But I read one book in preparation for this morning I found recommended by the World Economic Forum as one of the 10 must-buys from books published last year. Here it is. You won't see it from the back. It's entitled Leadership BS. I was on a train coming back from London to Worcester last week with a politician, and I showed him the book. I said I thought it was good. He said, "What's BS?" And I said, "Well, speaking as a politician, really, you ought to know." But I'm no one to throw stones in that respect. The author of this book, Jeffrey Pfeffer, says that at the beginning that he wanted to engage directly with the topic of leadership and examine why the writing, blogging and speaking has been so manifestly unsuccessful. I quote, "Leaders fail their people, their organisations, the larger society with unacceptable frequency. How can this be? All this failure after thousands of leadership books, talks, blogs, classes and leadership development programs seeking to make leaders more effective. How can this be after more than a century of research seeking to figure out how to select better leaders?" There's a delicious irony in the fact that immediately after today, Bishop Stephen and I are going to have to jump on a train in order to go to a 3-day residential on leadership for bishops. We're going to be, it would perhaps have been better for me to give this talk after that, but we're going to be taught in that time and following how to be good leaders. You might think it's a bit late, but better late than never. And I have to say that I'm part of the problem. I mean, I'm looking forward to this course. I'm sure there'll be insights in it, but I don't think it can be as transformative as is sometimes hoped. And I'm part of the problem. I've been closely associated with the leadership organisation Common Purpose almost since it was founded. I was a trustee of Common Purpose International for a number of years. I now rejoice in the wonderful title of Trust Protector, which I love. It's like something out of Star Wars. It really means that if there is a dispute about the brand when Common Purpose sets up in another country, then I have to be the final arbiter. There's a similar thing for The Economist, but don't need to go into that. The author of Leadership BS, as you'd expect, has his own theory on where we've gone wrong, and he's hoping it'll sell books. I want to propose another with a distinctly Christian flavour. And then Loveday will give you the real deal from the Bible, building on the Fayot report on leadership. What I want to suggest to you is that when reflecting upon leadership, we very often bark up the wrong tree, to use a technical term. We ask the wrong questions. And in order to think differently, I want to take you to that famous statement by the Duke of Wellington that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. Now, I'm a bit wary of that quote when an old Etonian is Archbishop of Canterbury and the Prime Minister is the 19th Prime Minister to have been educated at Eton. I wasn't. I don't have an axe to grind for or against Eton or anyone else, anywhere else for that matter. It's what lies behind that comment upon which I want to concentrate. Because that reflection on the climax of the Napoleonic Wars wasn't a statement of personal modesty. It was a recognition of the fact that the success of a leader in battle will depend on the character of those engaged. He was suggesting that this country at that time was fortunate to have institutions which formed people with the kind of virtues that could survive and even thrive in the circumstances of war. Eton and Waterloo represent two distinct aspects of the moral life. Eton represents a long period of preparation, and Waterloo represents the tiny moment of implementation, the moment of decision of the situation. Now, very many talks, books, blogs on leadership, much leadership training concentrates upon the sort of dilemmas that leaders are likely to face and how they might find their way through them. And the trouble is that life then can appear to be a series of hopeless quandaries, which are hurdles at which even the most superhuman will fall. And that's, I would suggest, because it's become the norm to concentrate on Waterloo without seeing the significance of character formation, to study Waterloo as if it took place in vacuo. Or, we might say, to legislate, to regulate for Waterloo without thinking about the training that led up to it. We become fixated on the battlefield and failed to realise the importance of the training ground. You do hear intimations of it surfacing now and then. It was suggested a bit back, I read it on the national BBC website, that maybe nurses should receive some training in compassion. And you thought, have we really come to that? When it's thought that nurses in their jobs need some training in compassion. I think, in other words, what we do is to concentrate our attention on right and wrong decisions taken by leaders, actions taken by leaders in particular scenarios, rather than on the character of the people making the decisions. And that's where the Duke of Wellington's remark is so significant. The battle was won precisely because people had been trained to shoulder the kind of responsibility they were later to face at Waterloo. The real decisions, the ones that would determine the outcome of that battle, had actually taken place many years earlier. Now, what we're talking about here is what we would understand as formation, what we would understand as discipleship training. And we really need to recognise that we're good at that. We can do it if we concentrate our attention upon it. That's one of the reasons why I want to suggest that what I'm saying to you is good news. We don't need to be so angst-ridden about leadership. We need to concentrate on the formation that takes place in preparation for it. To illustrate the point, let me tell you about something that happened in an Edinburgh hospital in the 1950s. After a child died tragically on an operating table, two friends were talking over what happened. One of the friends expressed sympathy for the surgeon involved, since he'd encountered an unexpected complication. The other surgeon disagreed strongly, saying something like, "I think the man is to blame. If anybody had handed me ether instead of chloroform, I would have known from the weight that it was the wrong thing." You see, I know the man well. We were students together at Aberdeen, and he could have become one of the finest surgeons in Europe if only he'd given his mind to it. But he didn't. He was more interested in golf. So he used to do enough work to pass his examinations and no more. And that's how he lived his life, just enough to get through, but no more. So he's never picked up those seemingly peripheral bits of knowledge that one day may be crucial. The other day in that theatre, a bit of peripheral knowledge was crucial and he didn't have it. But it wasn't the other day that he failed. It was 39 years ago when he gave himself only half-heartedly to medicine. The Duke of Wellington's observation about a Belgian field surely applies equally well to the Edinburgh operating table. Just as the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, so the battle for the sick child was lost on a golf course. An athlete trains for months for a marathon race, and no amount of enthusiasm on the day can make up for that training. A student studies for years in preparation for an examination, and no amount of thought on the day can make up for deficiencies in preparation. A doctor studies and trains and practices for years to excel in surgery, and no amount of goodwill or flair on the day can make up for deficiencies in preparation. Now, what I'm advocating, which will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure, is an aspect of what's become known as virtue ethics, as opposed to what is sometimes characterized as quandary ethics. What I'm saying, in other words, is that ethics is not primarily about the operating theatre, but about the lecture theatre, the training field, the practice hall, the library, the tutorial, the mentoring session, or, in our terms, the immersion in the scriptures, the training, the discipleship. There are two times. One is the time for moral effort, the other the time for moral habit. The time for moral habit is the time for formation and training. We have all the things that we need imbued into us, not just intellectually, but through our whole beings. We develop skills and habits that mean that we take the right things and decisions for granted, so that when the time comes, what we need to do, even under immense stress, is second nature to us. And what's true of the ethical life is surely true of leadership, as much as is implied by the Duke of Wellington's comment. Leadership shouldn't be construed as an agony of impossible choices any more than should life itself. Instead, leadership should be experienced as a matter of habit and instinct. The most important moral decisions we make are those about which we don't even stop to think. We can easily see that through an illustration. You step outside after this lecture and you observe someone being hit by a tram. You don't stop and think to yourself, now, what's the best thing to do here? Should I intervene? Should I not? You don't go through an agony of decision making. You go to the aid of the person who's been knocked over. The decision comes so naturally and quickly that it's almost instinctive. And if I were to ask you why you went to help that person, you might well say, well, that's just what you do, isn't it? It wouldn't seem like a question worth asking. But it's worth teasing out the implications of that almost reflex action. We wouldn't think much of someone who wanted to initiate a debate about whether to call an ambulance when someone had been run over. It's surely the sort of person who's been formed in virtue who will then consciously and unconsciously faithfully improvise, to use terminology from the Fayok report, upon that training. What will have caused him or her to do so without even stopping to think? Where do we receive that sort of training for the moral life, for leadership? Well, I hope that the answer to that question will be obvious to you as well, but it's worth thinking a bit about it. And I want to quote to you a favourite illustration of mine, which the former Chief Rabbi, Lord Sachs, gives, which I think is really powerful. He says, you're showing someone the sights of London. Outside Parliament, someone asks, what happens there? And you say, politics. And she asks, what's politics about? And I say, it's about the creation and distribution of power. And then we go to the city and you see the Bank of England, and she asks, what happens there? And you say, economics. And she says, what's economics about? And you say it's about the creation and distribution of wealth. And then we pass St. Paul's Cathedral and she asks, what happens there? And you say, worship. And she asks, what's worship about? What does it create and distribute? Now you might respond, not very much as an answer to that question, but that would be very wrong, because places of worship distribute and create something of the utmost importance, though it's seldom recognised. It's fascinating that for the past several generations, argument has waged between those on the right who tell us that the market has the solution to all our problems, in other words, economics, and those on the left who argue that the state has the solution to all our problems, politics. In other words, argument has raged between politics and economics, the state and the market, the logic of power and the logic of wealth. The state is us in our collective capacity, the market is us as individuals. And the debate has been which is more effective. Now, to my mind, you can argue about the balance between the two. Any effective society will need both, and the balance will be a matter of debate. But there is a third way of getting people to act in a sensible way. In terms of the market and in terms of politics, we either force them to the way of power or we pay them to the way of wealth. But there's a third way. And we see this by performing a simple thought experiment. Imagine you have total power, and then you decide to share it with 9 others. How much do you have left? You have, presumably, 1/10 of the power that you had when you began. Now suppose you have £1,000 and you decide to share it with 9 others. What do you have left? You have 1/10 of that with which you began, £100. But now, suppose you decide to share not power or wealth, but love or friendship or influence or even knowledge. How much do you have left after you share it with 9 others? Do you have less? No, you have more, much more, perhaps even 10 times as much. Why? Because love, friendship, virtue, the sort of things that we concentrate upon developing in our discipleship are things that only exist by virtue of sharing. They're what we might term covenantal goods, goods that the more I share, the more I have. In the short term, at least, wealth and power are zero-sum games. If I win, you lose, and vice versa. Covenantal goods are non-zero-sum games. So the answer to the question about St. Paul's is that places of worship, the religious life, the Christian life, we might say, create and distribute these covenantal goods on which the proper functioning of both the state and the market depends, but, and this is the crucial point, which neither the state nor the market can create. Any civilized and properly functioning society depends on virtues, trust, loyalty, responsibility, fairness, compassion. The state and the market depend on those values for their proper functioning, but they cannot create them. They're born not in the state, not in the market, but in the family, in congregations, in the intermediate institutions of society, and we would say, par excellence, in the church, in our formation. The word religion, I probably don't need to remind you, means to bind. It's not surprising, therefore, that in a society where religion isn't embraced and the other intermediate institutions associated of society more or less atrophy, covenantal values within them begin to wither. So there is a real problem out there, but it's good news for us in that we have the means in order to do something about this. There's a huge job to be done. We've lost our spiritual roots as a society, our spiritual bearings. Let me give you an example. If I were to ask you, what's the connection between the National Health Service and the Christian faith? I wonder what you'd say. Most people, I think, would reckon that there isn't much connection. But in fact, to Beveridge, Temple and Tawney and those who designed the National Health Service to be a central pillar of the welfare state, it would have been very clear indeed. The National Health Service was designed as an institutional answer to the question, who is my neighbour? That question will be a very familiar one to those of us schooled in the scriptures, those who have the story of the Good Samaritan etched on our consciousness. Ethics is about being trained in the school of loving your neighbour as yourself. And it's one that we are in danger of losing in our society. So, where are the fields of Eton, the playing fields of Eton, on which good leaders will play in order to learn what they need to learn so that they might operate as good leaders and indeed as good members of society? Well, they are, brothers and sisters, par excellence, the churches which you and I have responsibility for leadership of. And we need to be alive to that fact. We need to rejoice in it. And we need to ensure that we put as much resource as we possibly can into our own spiritual growth, into the spiritual growth of others, into the deepening of the discipleship of all those for whom we have responsibility. And then we need to immerse ourselves, when we're thinking about Christian leadership, in a scriptural approach to what leadership is about. There is something particular and distinctive, I would suggest, about Christian leadership. Now, Love Day will expand this afternoon upon a New Testament theology of leadership, and what she will have to say will be immensely helpful, I think. I want to concentrate on one particular, what seems to me, crucial text, which will be familiar, very familiar to you all, but it's worth our while reminding ourselves of it. It's that passage when the mother of the sons of Zebedee comes to Jesus with her sons and, kneeling before him, asks a favour of him. It's a wonderfully charming scene, I think. I mean, it's what every mother wants for her children. She wants the best for her children. You know, do something for my kids, please. But then you remember the 10, when they heard about it, were angry. And then the crucial words of Jesus, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you, but whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So, leadership for us is about playing out those aspects of the virtuous life in which we have been formed in the service of others. Jesus distances himself from hierarchy, power, and control of the world's leaders of his time and introduces what was a uniquely innovative concept of leadership through service. And if you're in any doubt about how innovative, how revolutionary it was, I recommend, if you haven't done so, reading David Bentley Hart's brilliant book, Atheist Delusions. Some have, in revisionist accounts, tried to suggest that all the virtues that we associate with the Christian faith were there in the pagan world. They weren't. The Christian faith, based as it was upon the preeminence of charity, reflecting a God of love, was something unique and really revolutionary. Jesus tells his disciples that greatness means laying aside concern for status and using one's gift in the service of fellow human beings. And Jesus, of course, reinforces this crucial teaching in action when he washes the disciples' feet at the Last Supper. The full power of that symbolism is easy for us to miss as our feet stay reasonably clean in shoes. It was very different in Jesus' day. The sort of service involved in the washing of feet was the lowest of the low. But that's what Jesus' disciples are called to. I've set you an example that you should do as I've done to you. My sainted predecessor St. Woolston took this very seriously and literally, and washed the feet of 12 poor people every day. He actually died doing it. That seems to me to be taking it a bit far. But it speaks of a vision for a society, in which the leaders have been schooled in compassion and justice and a commitment to service. Now, Jesus teaches of leadership through service. He symbolizes it at the Last Supper, but also, of course, he embodies it by who he is through his incarnation, through his life and his death. The foot washing, I would suggest, can be seen as an acting out of that wonderful hymn in Philippians 2, where we read that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. So in the account of the foot washing, the table can be seen to be symbolic of heaven, which Jesus leaves. The outer robe, of which he divests himself, can be seen as to represent the trappings of divinity, of which he strips himself. And the towel can be seen as a symbol of both human nature and of service. So it's all there for us, magnificently acted out in the scriptures. And in the face of Jesus, we see, of course, the character of God. To have seen me is to have seen the Father. What Christian leaders are called to do is to act out in the service of others those virtues of trust, loyalty, responsibility, fairness, compassion. You can think of lots of other gospel values which they have learned in discipleship. Now, the model of service, it seems to me, has been all but lost from view in public life. I'm aware of the dangers of romanticising the past, but I observe that it's not very long, a generation or two, since people in all aspects of life, or at least very many of aspects of life, from shopkeepers to train drivers, from nurses to teachers, from bankers to cleaners, would have seen their work and their calling, they would have called it, in terms of service to community. At the same time, young people were educated to serve God, King and country. And although, of course, that approach has its shortcomings, it's surely much better than what one sees in educational circles nowadays as an exclusive focus upon developing individual potential to no particular end, it would seem to me, except making money, which characterises much of the rationale of an increasingly utilitarian education system in our society. The ideal of service is one of the great outplayings of the Christian faith in which this country has been formed over generations. But if it's been lost in society, it needs to remain absolutely central to what we're about. It's what we have to offer. It's not often referred to in church circles. I picked up a bit back this document, Working with the Spirit, Choosing Diocesan Bishops. Now, it was published quite some time ago, but it forms the basis upon which the process still functions. There's much talk of openness in it, which could hardly be argued to be a concept central to the New Testament. I would say that those who extol the virtues of openness, transparency, and accountability, which are much trumpeted virtues in our society, should be directed or redirected to Honora O'Neill's magnificent 2002 Wreath Lectures, A Question of Trust, in which she points out that measured by its own standards, the culture of openness, transparency, and accountability has failed dismally, since all the indications are that there is less trust in our society than there was in the old days. The same, it could be argued, is true of leadership, despite the enormous amount of attention that is paid to it in the secular world and indeed in the church. Is there that much evidence that the leadership that is being offered is better now than it was? Or is there just a lot more angst about it? It would seem to me that it's really crucial that we should go back to first principles when thinking about leadership and concentrate upon discipleship, formation, catechesis. We're not as good at that, despite the very excellent efforts of your diocesan bishop over a long period of time. We're not as good as that as we ought to be. I acted as the theological consultant to the Meissen Commission Theological Conference some time ago. The theme was confirmation. And there were papers from the Lutheran side and there were papers from the Anglican side. It was fascinating to me that all the Lutheran papers concentrated exclusively on catechesis. And those of you who know the German church will know that an enormous amount of effort is put into preparing people for confirmation. It's still very much a rite of passage. Enormous numbers of young people go through it. They receive a year of quite intense formation, discipleship training prior to confirmation. All the Anglican papers focused exclusively upon the liturgy. That traditionally is how we as Anglicans have worked out our theology, through our liturgy. But I wonder how many of you could put your hand on your hearts and say that you feel that those who you prepare for confirmation are really adequately prepared. I wonder whether the numbers of confirmands is the number that you would wish. Now, I don't want to depress you or challenge you. I simply want to encourage you to say that we have the means at our disposal. And there's one further thing that it's worth saying. In the conversation last night, you'll find out this afternoon that Loveday likes to think in triangles, and I do the same. We decided that there was maybe three sides to the triangle, the leadership triangle. She'll talk about it from a New Testament perspective, but there's the God side, the individual side, and those being led. So there's three vertices of that triangle, if you can imagine it. And the self side is really important. Those two wonderful quotes that Bishop Stephen gave us at the beginning of this morning. The first one, the contemporary one, recognises the importance of formation and ongoing immersion in the life of prayer and spirituality, so that when the test comes, we will have the resilience to deal with it. What happened when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness? 3 times he was tempted by the devil. What did he do on each occasion? He quoted scripture at the devil. Scripture was so much part of his being that it came as second nature to him. And that was what he used to rebut the devil. And our ongoing formation as individuals is really important in that. But our care for ourselves as individuals is also really important, as was implied in the quote from Gregory the Great. There's a wonderful chapter in the book that John Cleese wrote with his therapist, Robin Skinner. Some of you might remember it, published quite a few years ago, but in it there's an awful lot of really wonderful distilled psychology. And the chapter which really sticks in my mind is one of which the title is, "Look, Daddy, I'm the chairman of Consolidated International." How many leaders are really working out their own angst, their own difficulties, showing really the people they want to show, their mummies and daddies, that they're really clever boys and girls, that they've got to the top. What we need to do is to concentrate upon our inner life, our spirituality, and the place that needs to start is in here. I have a theory about Nelson Mandela, that all those years on Robben Island weren't wasted. He went in an angry, very angry, understandably, justifiably, very angry young man. He came out 29 years later with what seemed like a superhuman capacity to forgive. Why was that? I'd suggest that it may well be because he was forced to concentrate upon the inner life during those years. He was forced to deal with the demons within so that he was less likely to project evil onto others. Now, to be sure, there is evil out there, but if we're going to deal with the evil out there, we need to deal with the log in here. That concentration, that for him was the playing fields of Eden. That long concentration enabled him to go out and do something wonderful. There's a similar quote which will be familiar to some of you, a similar instance of this in a quotation from Merton in the Seven-Storey Mountain, when he comes out of the monastery for the first time for 12 years, and he has that extraordinary vision on the corner of Walnut Street, where he suddenly has this vision of all these people shining like the sun. He says when he went into the monastery, he saw the world as just full of evil. But when he came out, he saw the goodness in these people and how loved they were. And he says that they were shining like the sun. He says, who will tell them that they're shining like the sun? And the point I want to make in this is that our ongoing formation in the inner life is of crucial importance. And if I save that to last, it's because that's probably the most important. I'm sometimes haunted by the Jungian insight. Jung calls it, as many of you will know, individuation, that in the first half of life, it's our responsibility to concentrate upon the outer life, establishing ourselves over and against our parents, making a living, all that sort of stuff. But in the second half of life, our responsibility is to work on the inner life. Now, as Christians, we would say we need to work on both all the way through. But do we work in prayer, in reading the scriptures, in doing all the things that we know will build us up, will form us in the way that we ought to? And once again, the good news is that we have got the tools to do that. We have the tools to form ourselves and others in the disciplines that will be necessary to form us as good human beings and good leaders. We have the tools that are necessary in our overarching narrative of service, or being able to dedicate ourselves to others. And we have the tools that are necessary to develop our own inner life, work on our own inner life. If we're able to do that, we shall do something worthwhile for ourselves and for others. I've observed at close quarters Archbishops of Canterbury for a while, and it seems to me, I'm a great fan of the last Archbishop, Rowan, for whom I have a profound affection and respect, and the same is true for our present Archbishop. They are very, very different people, But it seems to me that they have something very important in common, and that is that they're at ease with themselves. They're not trying to prove to mummy or daddy that they are the chairman of Consolidated International. They don't have anything to prove to anyone, and that sets them free in order to be of service to others in leadership, drawing upon those resources that they have received in their formation as Christians. Our society needs us. Our world needs us. It needs us as leaders who have been so formed in the Christian faith that we will be able to lead others in that faith and so enable them to be dedicated to the service of the kingdom. So as I say, I don't suppose I've said very much to you today that is new, but I do hope that it's made you perhaps reflect a little upon the link between spirituality and leadership, how much that you have to offer and how much that we can do as a church. We have all that is necessary for the ministry and the leadership that God has called us to. Thank you.